One thing to notice when you're looking at Egyptian history is that you go to different books, different scholars, and the picture is not always the same. And here's one scholar that makes a very good point here. Here's a statement from a very well-known Egyptologist, Sir Alan Gardner. As you can see, he's very well qualified. And this is what he had to say. It must never be forgotten that we're dealing with a civilization thousands of years old, and one of which only tiny remnants have survived. What is proudly advertised as Egyptian history is merely a collection of rags and tatters. And that's a good point to note. When people try to take Egyptian culture and history and try to fit it into the Bible, you're dealing with something that we're only seeing glimpses of, if you know what I mean. Most of the Egyptian history has been lost, and we've only got little bits to go on. So there's always a little bit of a danger when you try to connect Egyptian history with Bible history. But I'd like to share some things, and again, you can decide on this, just how well things do tie up. Now, for years, scholars have said the Bible must be made up because when you go to Egyptian history, you don't find the Exodus story found in the Bible. You don't find it in Egypt, at least Egyptian history as it's been recorded by the Egyptians. And because of that, here's a typical statement that some of the scholars make. This gentleman here, Philip Davies, is a professor of biblical studies at the University of Sheffield, and he said this. He said the society that was created in the Bible and their history was an imaginary one, a fictional one. I don't believe in the reality of 3.5 million people wandering across the Sinai Desert for 40 years. I don't believe in the crossing of the Red Sea with the water standing up. And this is the view of many scholars today, particularly in academic circles and university. They essentially say, we don't believe the Bible. It's imaginary. As he says here, it's a fictional one, an imaginary one. And what I'll put to you, if you look in the right place and think carefully about what you'd expect to find, you do find bits of evidence, even in Egyptian history, about the Exodus story. And we'll look at some of those tonight and see if we can join some of the dots. So we're going to go to the land of the pyramids again, just briefly. One thing to note is the inscriptions and the monuments they built weren't there to record the daily news. A lot of these monuments there were to make the pharaoh look like a god, because essentially Egyptians believed the pharaoh was a god on earth. And most of these monuments were built to extol the virtues of the pharaoh. Do you follow that? It's sort of to make him look like a hero, and therefore he deserved to be the king of Egypt. And so what you find recorded here is not always entirely accurate history. In fact, there's accounts on some of these, like a particular pharaoh conquering the Hittites and winning many victories. But when you go to the Hittite records, you actually find out that the pharaoh lost some of these battles. So you've got to be careful. You have to compare one group of records with another, and you find they don't always match up. Now, if we go back to the story of the Exodus, when Moses went to meet Pharaoh, you remember the story how Pharaoh refused to let God's people go? And so God sent the plagues. Do you remember that? Here's a little picture of the stars being turned to snakes. You remember that? We're dealing with a real battle here between truth and error. And God sent the plagues. Remember, here's the list of the 10 plagues that God sent. Now, these were devastating. If you go through the plagues and look at them, they absolutely devastated Egypt. Like the locusts, it says, basically consumed everything that was living on the ground. You had hail mingled with fire. You had the cattle getting diseases. And of course, the last one, all the firstborn were slain. These plagues devastated Egypt. Now, you'd think you'd find some record somewhere of this event. And you do, not on the stone monuments, but in the papyrus records. Now, the papyrus was built from this plant that used to grow in the Nile. It's not in Egypt anymore. That's an interesting Bible prophecy that papyrus would cease from the land of Egypt. But back in the time of the Exodus, they used to use papyrus for records. You can go to Egypt today and see how they, even today for the tourists, they make up papyrus sheets by taking strips of the papyrus plant and they roll it out and weave it together, make paper. And I'd like to share with you a papyrus that's found in Holland, in the Leiden Museum there, Leiden, Netherlands, the Dutch Museum of Antiquities. there's the papyrus called the Ipuwer papyrus. Has anyone heard of the Ipuwer papyrus? Maybe not. Well, when you look at the translation of this, it's very interesting when you compare what the Bible had to say about the Exodus. First of all, let's look at some Bible verses that described what was going on in Egypt at the time, and you compare that with what this papyrus reported. It's quite interesting. Remember in Exodus chapter 7, it talked about how Moses lifted up his rod and smote the waters, and all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. And it said the Egyptians digged round about the river for water to drink because they couldn't drink the river water. Now this papyrus, which you can see in the museum in Holland, talks about pestilences throughout the land, blood is everywhere, and it goes on to say the river, which is the Nile, is blood. Men shrink and thirst after water. Now that's interesting. Someone might say, well, that's a coincidence. And some scholars try to write these off as, well, it's just a coincidence, or maybe there was a flood and the water got discoloured. But some of the details you'll see as we go on are very specific. The Bible talked about a plague upon the cattle, the horses, the asses, the camels, the oxen, and the sheep, a very grievous plague. This papyrus talked about all animals, their hearts weep, cattle moan. So something was happening with the cattle when this papyrus is recorded. Now here's a very interesting one. The Bible talks about hail coming down, and it says fire ran along upon the ground. Very intriguing. That's not normal hail, is it? And it says, so there was hail and fire mingled with the hail, very grievous. Now, it's obviously not normal hail that we see today, is it? But have a look at what this papyrus recorded. Very intriguing. It says the fire ran along the ground. There was hail and fire mingled with the hail. Very intriguing. That's almost a direct quote from the Bible. And this is from an Egyptian record that has nothing to do with the Bible. And it goes on here to talk about how columns and walls are consumed by fire. Interesting. It talked about the plague of locusts in the Bible. They covered the whole face of the earth, so the land was darkened. And they ate every herb and all the fruit. And it says, there remained not any green thing in the trees. So these locusts just stripped everything bare. This papyrus talked about no fruit nor herbs are found. It talks about trees are destroyed and the branches are stripped off. And it mentions a noise. It says, oh, that the earth would cease from noise and tumult. Uproar be no more. That maybe was the beating of the wings, these clouds and clouds of locusts. The Bible talked about a thick darkness in the land for 3 days. And it's interesting, this papyrus records something very similar. It says, the land is without light. Then, of course, the last plague, the most devastating of all. It talks about all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die. Of course, except where they put the blood on the doorposts, as you may recall. And what happened? This struck Egypt very severely. Even Pharaoh, his firstborn died. It says, Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. Every family in Egypt had been afflicted by this plague. And this papyrus seems to report the same event. It says, he who places his brother in the ground is everywhere. Groanings throughout the land mingled with lamentations. Forsooth, the children of princes are dashed against the walls. The children of princes are cast out in the streets. That seems to be a reference to the same thing. And then what happened when Pharaoh finally said, go, leave the land? You remember what the Hebrews did? They'd been slaves for many years. And they went and collected their pay, so to speak. And it says, they requested from the Egyptians silver and gold items and clothing. And the Lord gave the people favour in the sight of the Egyptians. And they gave them whatever they wanted. So they plundered Egypt. It's interesting to see what this papyrus says. It says, the plunderer is everywhere. And the servant takes what he finds. Indeed, poor men have become wealthy. Gold, silver, and jewels are fastened to the necks of female slaves. Slaves who have now been freed are throughout the land. The king's storehouse has now become common property. This sounds very much like the same sort of thing going on here. What was very important, though, of course, is what was happening during the time of the plagues, when there was darkness in the land of Egypt, people are being afflicted with sores and so forth. What was God doing for his people? Do you remember that there were swarms of flies at one time? It says, the house of the Egyptians shall be full of swarms of flies, and also the ground whereupon they are. And I will sever in that day the land of Goshen, in which my people dwell, so that no swarms of flies shall be there. God was protecting his people. What about the plague upon the cattle? It says, and all the cattle of Egypt died, but of the cattle of the children of Israel died not one. God was protecting his people, wasn't he, from these plagues? What about this one? The magicians couldn't stand before Moses because of the boils. They had boils and these sores all over them. The boil was upon the magicians and upon all the Egyptians, but not upon God's people. What about the hail that smote throughout all the land of Egypt? Only in the land of Goshen, where the children of Israel were, was there no hail. Once again, God preserved his people during the time of these plagues. And what about when darkness covered the land of Egypt? Moses stretched forth his hand toward heaven, and there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt for 3 days. They saw not one another, neither rose any from his place for 3 days. But and all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings. Interesting. And of course, that wonderful salvation, if you like, when they were told to put blood on the doorposts, God preserved his people during that time. And finally, when the Hebrews left, and Pharaoh said, go, get out of the land, lest we all be dead men. As they left, it says, against any of the children of Israel shall not a dog move his tongue against man or beast, that ye may know that the Lord doth put a difference between the Egyptians and Israel. Now, this is very significant because the Bible talks about, and we may get a chance later in the series to look at some of that if we get time, it talks about the 7 last plagues. Have you read that in the book of Revelation? And once again, God is going to preserve his people during that time. And so what we want to seek to do is become part of God's people in that day, when once again he's going to put a difference between those who receive the mark of the beast and receive the plagues, and those who receive the seal of God. In fact, it talks about this in Psalms 91. Here's a wonderful promise for the future. It talks about, thou shalt not be afraid for the terror by night, nor the arrow that flieth by day, nor for the pestilence that walketh in darkness, nor for the destruction that wasteth at noonday. 1,000 shall fall at thy side, and 10,000 at thy right hand, but it shall not come nigh thee. A wonderful promise here in verse 10. There shall no evil befall thee, neither shall any plague come nigh thy dwelling. And what's the reason? Because in verse 9, because thou hast made the Lord, which is my refuge, even the Most High, thy habitation. So people that trust in God in this time that's coming up, spoken of in the book of Revelation, will be safe from those 7 last plagues the Bible talks about. Now, getting back to Egyptian history again, when did the events of the Exodus occur? Can we work out the timing of this? And the answer is yes, if we look in the right place. I've got a little video clip coming up again. This is about 6 minutes long again. And this asks the question, who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? Who was the Pharaoh at the time when Moses came down? Who did Moses speak to when he said, let my people go? And this video starts to join some of the dots. And after the video, we've got some more very interesting dots we can join.
While a body of archaeological evidence supports the historical validity of the Exodus, speculation still surrounds the true identity of the Pharaoh responsible for the Hebrews' bondage and flight from Egypt. Not surprisingly, there are no helpful clues in Egypt's often self-serving historical records. Nor is the Pharaoh of the Exodus mentioned by name anywhere in the Old Testament accounts. However, Despite the lack of direct evidence, scholars continue their attempts to define the key personalities of the Exodus narrative. And during the past century, two conflicting theories have emerged. They are based on what is now known as the early and late dates of the Exodus. Supporters of the late chronology usually identify Ramesses the Great as the pharaoh who enslaved Israel. The basis for this theory is found in the Old Testament.
So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor, and they built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses.
Although there were several Egyptian kings named Ramesses, Ramesses II is most often tied to the accounts of the Israelites' bondage. The reasons are obvious. At the time of Ramesses' birth, in roughly 1304 BC, the period now called the 19th dynasty, Egypt was at the peak of her glory. Ramesses ascended the throne in 1290 BC with a vision to expand his nation's borders. He decided to move his capital from the ancient city of Thebes to the northeastern Nile Delta. There he built a new royal city and called it Pi-Ramesses. Some historians have reasoned that because the name Pi-Ramesses was similar to the city identified in the Old Testament, Ramesses II must have been the pharaoh who enslaved the Hebrews as his workforce. Yet recent archaeological discoveries now reveal that Ramesses II may have actually built his capital and renamed it in his honor on the foundations of a city that had been constructed by Israelite hands at least 300 years earlier. Centuries later, ancient scribes who copied the first written documents of the Exodus account probably used Pi-Ramesses, the newer, more familiar name of the city, in their transcriptions. But if popular interpretations, including Cecil B. DeMille's epic film, depicting Ramesses as pharaoh of the Exodus are incorrect, then which Egyptian ruler actually confronted Moses and his God? Many believe the answer is linked directly to another Old Testament passage.
Now it came about in the 480th year, after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, that he began to build the house of the Lord.
Most historians agree that Solomon commenced building the temple in Jerusalem in 965 BC. According to the scriptures, this construction began 480 years after the Exodus. That means the biblical date of Israel's departure from Egypt is approximately 1445 BC, more than a century before Ramses II was born. This early date for the Exodus, 1445 BC, is supported by numerous archaeological discoveries. And if it is accurate, an intriguing scenario involving Moses and some of Egypt's most illustrious rulers takes shape. 1445 BC would mean the Exodus occurred in the middle of Egypt's 18th dynasty. This was a period when the great shrines of Karnak, Luxor, and Deir el-Bahari rose majestically near the banks of the Nile. Within this chronology, Moses would have been born during the reign of Thutmoses I, a warrior king who helped make Egypt an imperial power. Thutmoses had a daughter named Hatshepsut. Some scholars have speculated she could have rescued the infant Moses from the Nile and raised him as her son. The very name Moses is of Egyptian derivation. Early in the 15th century BC, Hatshepsut, now herself ruler of Egypt, was locked in a vicious battle for power with her stepson, Thutmoses III. Thutmoses ultimately took control of the empire and erased the images of Hatshepsut from the monuments she had erected. His hatred for Hatshepsut was perhaps intensified by knowledge she had rescued and raised Moses with the hope he would one day succeed her as pharaoh. Thutmoses III was a ruthless conqueror and may well have been pharaoh during the peak of the Israelites' oppression. Some scholars have speculated that he also pursued the Israelites into the Red Sea, for the length of Thutmose's reign and the date of his death coincide almost perfectly with the early biblical chronology. Was Thutmoses III the pharaoh of the Exodus? Today, a scarcity of direct archaeological evidence and confusion over precise dating make it difficult to conclusively identify the Egyptian rulers who shaped the destiny of Moses and his people. Yet while these chapters of antiquity may never be completely defined, one thing is certain. The glory of Egypt's pharaohs has long faded into the desert sands. But accounts of Moses and his faith still endure and inspire after 3,500 years.
Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed that. A little bit of an overview. And that little clip brought out some very, very good points. For example, you might have seen that the Bible actually gives a date for the time of the Exodus, counting back from the 4th year of Solomon's reign. Here's the verse, 1 Kings chapter 6, verse 1. The 4th year of Solomon's reign, and that the year that he began to build the house of the Lord, was the 480th year after the children of Israel will come out of the land of Egypt. And we know we're on solid ground if we go on what the Bible says. Now, my friend Leonard, who's written a nice book about this, you can actually buy this from Amazon or Koorong bookshops in Australia. He's done a lot of research, and actually this is a fascinating thing, by the way. This inscription here, it's called the Joseph Stone. It's in the Nile. It's on an island in the Nile River. And it describes, it's actually written by the priests of Egypt many years after the time of Joseph. And it's saying we should not have to pay tax because in the time of the 7 years famine, Pharaoh Joseph exempted us from tax. And if you look up the Bible story of the story of Joseph, that's almost a direct quote from that. Very interesting. It's called the Joseph Stone. And this is Leonard, myself, and Noah's Ark. We'll talk about that site next week. But in his book, he has a very nice little chart which shows this. Scholars believe around about 966, 965 BC was when they began to build the temple. Solomon began to reign about 970. So you count back 480 years and it takes you to around about 1446, 1445 BC. And that takes you to the time in the Egyptian dynasties where you had Hatshepsut, and that fits very nicely that she was the daughter of the Pharaoh and she adopted Moses. And if you fit biblical chronology in here, Moses spent 40 years in the land of Midian, and work out who was Pharaoh when he came back 40 years later, we come to a very interesting period in Egyptian history. Now, the Egyptians had a system of co-regency. You had Pharaoh ruling on the throne at Thebes, and his eldest son, or the crown prince, if you like, ruled in Memphis. And the titles would change. When they were crown prince, they were given one name, and when they became the pharaoh, they received another name. It's a little bit like you can think about the system we have in the New Zealand monarchy system. You have Prince Charles, who's the Prince of Wales. You've probably heard of that. But one day, his title will change from Prince of Wales into, what? The King of England. Do you understand? His title will change, although it's the same person. And apparently, the Egyptians did the same thing. Crown Prince Thutmoses IV became Amenhotep III, and his son was Tutankhamun. Now again, different scholars have different ideas. Sometimes they swap these people around, so this is not necessarily in concrete, but this is one way that the dots join very, very nicely. For example, Thutmoses IV changed his name. His title became Amenhotep III when he became Pharaoh. Now, if you go to the Sphinx, between the legs of the Sphinx is this enormous stone stele, and there's an inscription on here written by Thutmoses IV. And he claims on this stone that one day he was sleeping by the Sphinx, and the Sphinx spoke to him in a dream. And the Sphinx said to him, "If you clear the sand away from me, I will make you Pharaoh." And obviously he became the Pharaoh later. And you've got to ask, why would Thutmoses IV create this stele with this story, this account of the Sphinx giving him a dream, giving him a title to become the Pharaoh, if he had it by right. And the thinking goes this way. He's created this story to justify his ascension to the throne because he may not have had it by birthright. Which means, if you think this through, he was not the firstborn. He had to have another claim to become the title, to become the Pharaoh. And that makes sense because you think about when all the firstborn were slain in the land of Egypt, the Pharaoh, who in theory should have been the firstborn son, he did not die. Does that make sense? If he was the firstborn, then the Pharaoh would have died as well. But this would explain that because in theory, he wasn't the firstborn. He had to have another claim to the throne. Now this is his son, Tutankhamun, probably very familiar with him, a very well-known discovery because his tomb was discovered undisturbed. It hadn't been robbed when it was discovered in 1922. And everybody's familiar with this death mask that was found on the mummy of Tutankhamun. A very elaborate funeral. Here's the coffin. They had coffins within coffins. And some of the items that were discovered in his tomb are quite amazing. If you ever get to Egypt and go to the Cairo Museum, you'll see all these things. Because in their thinking, when somebody died and they wanted to take these items into the next life, it had to be buried with him. So this is all his earthly treasure that he was going to take with him into the next life, had to be put in the tomb with him. And so his tomb was full of interesting items. Of course, they had the chariots there, which were very helpful in thinking about the Exodus, but many other items. Little model boat here, chests and things, as his bed. You can go and see this in the Cairo Museum. Lots of different items. A lot of it was gold. There's another bed or couch that he had. Here's his throne. There's another shot of his throne there with Tutankhamun and his wife there. Second gold coffin, all made of gold. Quite remarkable. And inside that was another coffin made of solid gold. And if you look in the Cairo Museum today, you'll see these gold items they used to wear, these little handcuffs. Here's some more items. A gold dagger. And this was an iron dagger, cast iron. That was very valuable because iron was very hard to make. So that was looked after. There's his jandals, if you like, made of gold. And the little caps they put on his fingers. This is Tutankhamun himself. He's looking a little bit older there. He's a few thousand years old now. And people often wondered, he's actually quite young, how did he die? What caused Tutankhamun's death? And for years people have speculated on that. They did some x-rays many years ago, and these are the actual x-rays here. And when they did these x-rays, they noticed a fragment of bone here. And they thought, aha, this could be how he was killed. Somebody clubbed him on the back of the head one night when he was sleeping on his bed. You might have heard this theory. Came in with a club and hit him hard on the back of his head and killed him that way. And that piece of bone that showed up in the x-ray, there it is there, they speculated may have been a bone fragment that came off the back of his skull when he was clubbed. And that was a popular theory for many years. In fact, books were written about this. Here's one called The Murder of Tutankhamun, a 3,000-year-old murder mystery. And here's an interesting quote from this book. A bone fragment is clearly visible inside Tutankhamun's skull. Could this fragment have been the effect of a violent blow struck at the pharaoh's head with an evil intent, a blow that killed Tutankhamun? That's what they speculated for a long time. He went on to say this, though. If there was a significant hematoma, that's like a big blood clot from when the blow was struck, that remained for some time after the injury, this might be detectable with a high-powered CAT scan. If and when the mummy of Tutankhamun is examined again, this should rank high on the list of procedures to be performed. Well, you know, that was done. They did a CAT scan. Here's the BBC News report about this. It was done in 2005. They put Tutankhamun in the CT scanner and they scanned him. And one thing they found from this, they found no evidence of a blow on the back of the head. Here's what they said. A CT scanner of his remains in 2005 led researchers to say that he was not murdered and may have died of complications from a broken leg, something quite different. So after this CAT scan, They still didn't fully understand what he died of, but it says, all rejected the long-standing murder charge. Not all of them agreed. They still didn't understand what was going on here, but they could see clearly he did not die from a blow on the back of the head. They suggested maybe he died from an infection from a broken leg. That was one suggestion that came out of this. Others suggested maybe that leg was broken when Howard Carter pulled him out of the coffin, because apparently he was glued in there with resin. So maybe the broken leg came from that. Do you know, here's a report from the New Zealand Herald a couple of years ago, and guess what the theory is now? King Tut died of malaria. In other words, they don't know. They keep putting forward all these different theories, which as they do more investigation, they discover, okay, that's not the reason. What I'm going to suggest to you is something quite radical, but it fits. We're just going to join some dots here, and again, if you don't accept this, that's fine. There's no pressure on this, but I'll share some very interesting tie-ups. This is Tutankhamun here, and National Geographic reconstructed what he looked like. I don't know if you saw this a couple of years ago, where they modelled what he probably looked like. He was quite young, very young. Now, I'd like to share something with you very interesting. If you want to join the dots, I'm going to share something that doesn't come from Egypt, but comes from Turkey. This tablet here, this is a Hittite tablet, which you can go and see today in the Archaeology Museum in Istanbul. It's on display there. And this dates back to, notice the dating here, about the time of the Exodus, according to the Bible. The Hittites, by the way, covered this area here in Turkey. This is Egypt down here. This is where the pharaohs lived. But the Hittites were a growing power. They were rising into power. And this tablet is a Hittite tablet recording the deeds of one of the kings of the Hittites. It's the deeds of King Suppiluliuma I. And this is the archives, the records, if you like, the chronicles, written by his son. And this is a translation. You can see here, it's a bit hard to read, so here it is enlarged here. This is the translation they've got in the museum right by this tablet. And this is what King Suppiluliuma's son wrote about what was happening with his father, the king. And this is how it translates. It says, because their lord, Nibhururiya, and that is Tutankhamun. They know that. The translators know that this is Tutankhamun. So because Tutankhamun had just died, the Egyptian queen, who had become a widow, sent an envoy to my father and wrote him as follows. So this is Tut's widow, his wife, who's now a widow, writing to the king of the Hittites. And she says this, my husband died and I have no son. People say that you have many sons. If you were to send me one of your sons, he would become my husband. Never shall I pick out a servant of mine and make him my husband. I am afraid. Now this is intriguing, because when the Hittites got this letter from the Egyptian queen, they thought, wow, this is totally this isn't normal, because the Egyptians were seen as the world superpower. This was amazing. This would be like, if you want an equivalent today, imagine if Parliament in Wellington got a letter from the Congress in the United States saying, President Obama has just died. Please send us one of your MPs and he'll become President of the United States. That's what it would be the equivalent of. And you can read here in the tablet, it goes on to say, when my father heard that, he called the great council and said, since the most ancient times, such a thing has never happened before. It seems so out of the ordinary for the Hittites. He proceeded to dispatch Hattusili the chamberlain, saying, go, bring you reliable information back to me. They may try to deceive me. As to the possibility they may have a prince, bring me back information worthy of belief. In other words, this king thought, this is a bit suspicious here. Why would the world superpower want to have one of my sons to become king of their land? It doesn't make sense. And the tablet goes on to say this. The queen of Egypt wrote back to my father in a letter thus, why do you say they deceive me in that way? If I had a son, would I write to a foreign country in a manner which is humiliating to me in my country? Give me one of your sons, and he is my husband and king in the land of Egypt. Pretty radical, isn't it? And so what happened? The Hittite king finally sent a son down there. Because my father was kind-hearted, he complied with the lady's wishes and decided for sending his son. And the tablet in the museum, the little plaque in the museum, not the tablet, but the plaque next to it, says, from another text, we know that the Hittite prince never reached Egypt, but was murdered along the way. Something was going on in Egypt at this time. There was a power struggle going on. Can you see this? Now, if you think this through, why on earth would Tutankhamun's wife write to a foreign power asking for a son to be sent to Egypt for her to marry to become king of Egypt? This only makes sense in light of the Exodus. Does that make sense? You think about it. Egypt's been devastated. What happened to the army of Egypt? All drowned in the Red Sea. They're gone. The king, the pharaoh, is gone. The crown prince, Tutankhamun, who was going to be the next king, has just died as their firstborn in the plague. So here's this poor little widow saying, what are we going to do? As soon as the nations round about us hear what's gone on, we're going to be invaded. People are going to come in and strip Egypt bare. And they thought, I know. We'll form an alliance with the next world's most powerful country, the Hittites. If the king of the Hittites sends one of his sons down here, marries me, and if anybody dares attack us, guess who's going to come and help his son? Daddy will come down and help. Do you get the picture? That's the only way this makes any sense. It fits right into the Exodus. Now, of course, we know from the Bible how the Hebrews were saved by putting blood on the doorposts, and God initiated this or brought this in as what's called the Passover ceremony. You remember that? The Jews commemorated this every year, and you find this here in Leviticus 23. These are the feasts of the Lord, even holy convocations, which ye shall proclaim in their seasons. And the 14th day of the first month at even is the Lord's Passover. And they commemorated this every year. Even today, the Jews celebrate the Passover. And the Passover was the 14th day of the first month, like a calendar date, except one difference with the Hebrew calendar, it's based on a lunar cycle. Did you know that? They began their year on the sighting of a new moon. And so the 14th day of the first month would vary. In fact, here's a little chart. Oh, by the way, did you know that every Passover is always a full moon? It's a full moon ceremony. Here's a little chart showing dates for the Passover over different years. Like in 2006, it was the 13th of April. 2007, it was the 3rd of April. And so you have different dates when the Passover is celebrated. And here's little markers showing where they are. And it's always, because it's a lunar cycle, and the lunar month is about 29 and something days long, the Passover always occurs between mid-March and late April. It's always in that period. Do you follow that? The Passover, the 14th day of the first month, is always within this period because the Jewish year, started at different times depending on the cycle of the moon. Now, it's intriguing. If you go back to Tutankhamun's grave, his tomb, they found in his tomb this here. It's a floral collar, like someone would wear around their neck, made of flowers. And it's intriguing. If you look on the Luxor government website here, where it describes this is off the Egyptian government website, it says this: by examining the floral wreaths, they were able to establish the burial season of the sovereign between, and notice this, mid-March and late April. And how did they know that? It says because botanists recognized cornflowers, bittersweets, and mandrakes which blossomed during that period. So in other words, based on the type of flowers here, they could tell, we know what time of year Tutankhamun died. And they state it was between mid-March and late April. How intriguing. When does the Passover occur? Between mid-March and late April. Tutankhamun died, and I'm not saying this is proof, but it's another dot that joins, if you follow what I mean, that Tutankhamun died at the same time of the year that the Jews today celebrate the Passover. It's not proof, but it's just another little dot that joins up that suggests strongly Tutankhamun could well have been the firstborn of the pharaoh who died in that 10th plague, and then his father drowned in the Red Sea, chasing the Hebrews. Something intriguing to continue studying. And when he was buried, all the things that were buried with him were there for the afterlife. Now that raises a question that we want to have a look at for the rest of the evening. What does happen when you die? Did Tutankhamun take these things with him to the afterlife? If they did, why are they still there? And where is Tutankhamun? In fact, belief about the afterlife has inspired so many different things. Essentially, the pyramids were built to prepare the pharaoh for the next afterlife. And so many buildings around the world are there, like who's familiar with the Taj Mahal? Again, this was built as a memorial, as a monument to a dead princess. There's so much belief about the afterlife. What is the truth about happens? What happens when you die? Is there an afterlife? And where do we go when we pass away? Is death the end? Well, what we want to do is have a look through the Bible and have a really good look at that question, because it's so important for us today. Is the soul immortal, or is there a resurrection? Very important question. And what is the mystery of death? And can we communicate with the dead? Many people claim to be able to communicate with the dead. Did you know that? You've probably heard of seances where people get around a dark table with a candle and they supposedly talk with people that have died and talk to people who have passed to the other side. Have you heard of that? Very popular. It's a growing thing. So what we want to ask, and people who have done this have had very real experiences. They've been told things by supposedly spirits that only the dead person who's passed on would have known, at least as far as they knew. So what's the story here? Who are they actually communicating with? So we need to ask some questions. We want to answer these from the Bible. Do the dead actually live on? With whom are spirit mediums actually communicating? What actually happens when one dies, and what does the Bible teach? Do you believe we can trust the Bible? Do you believe that if we stand on what this says, we can test everything by this? I hope you do, because I certainly do. We should believe this before we believe our eyes. Does that make sense? Like we shared the other day, when Jesus revealed himself to his disciples, first of all, he gave them a Bible study before he revealed who he was, because he wants people to be grounded in his word. So let's have a look at what the Bible teaches. What did Jesus liken death to? Let's start real basic and real simple. What did Jesus liken death to? Well, there's a wonderful story in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5. Jesus had just come across the Sea of Galilee. And as he landed and as he got out of the boat up into the town there, it says, "Behold, there cometh one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and besought him greatly, saying, My little daughter lieth at the point of death. I pray thee, come and lay thy hands on her, that she may be healed, and she shall live." So here's this leader of the synagogue, had a little daughter, 12 years old we find out later, very sick, and he's pleading with Jesus, "Please come and save my daughter before she dies." Then something sad happened. While he yet spake, there came from the ruler of the synagogue's house certain which said, "Thy daughter is dead. She passed away. She didn't make it. Why troublest thou the master any further?" And as soon as Jesus heard the word that was spoken, he said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Be not afraid, only believe." So here comes news. Sorry, it's too late. The little girl has died. And Jesus says, don't worry, just believe. He cometh to the house of the ruler of the synagogue and sees the tumult. There must have been quite a big crowd there. And them that wept and wailed greatly. And when he was come in, he says unto them, "Why make ye this ado and weep? The damsel is not dead, but sleepeth." Now what had happened to the little girl? Was she just asleep? No, she was dead. In fact, people, it says they laughed him to scorn. They thought, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. This girl has just died. She's dead. She's not sleeping. But what happened? But when he had put them all out, in other words, he said, "Come on, get out of here, you guys." He taketh the father and the mother of the damsel, And then that were with him, and entered into where the damsel was lying. And he took the damsel by the hand and said unto her, Damsel, I say unto thee, arise. And straightway the damsel arose and walked, for she was the age of 12. And they were astonished with great astonishment. So here was this little girl that was dead, and Jesus simply says, arise, and brings her back to life. But what did Jesus use as the analogy? She was dead, wasn't she? Everyone knew that she was dead. They were having a funeral service, and when Jesus says he's just asleep, they laughed at him. So what was Jesus likening death unto? Sleep. And this is not the first time he does this. There's another story. Jesus had a very good friend named Lazarus, who was the brother of Mary and Martha. And you can read this in the Gospel of John. Now a certain man was sick, named Lazarus of Bethany. Therefore his sisters sent unto him to Jesus, saying, Lord, behold, him who thou lovest is sick. And when Jesus heard that, he said, This sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God might be glorified thereby. Jesus was going to do something here quite remarkable. And when he heard this, it says, when he had heard, therefore, that he was sick, he abode 2 days still in the same place where he was. Now, Jesus was somewhere down near the Sea of Galilee, and Bethany is up near Jerusalem. It's quite a hike. You can drive it in a couple of hours today, but there wasn't motor cars in those days. So Jesus waited a couple of days, and then it would have been probably at least a day's journey to get up there. And what did Jesus say to his disciples? Our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may wake him up. Now, when Jesus said that, how did the disciples understand what he said? Well, it goes on to say this. Then his disciples said, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get well. In other words, this is great. If he's sleeping, he's comfortable, he's on the mend, he's getting better. But what did Jesus mean when he said our friend Lazarus sleeps? The Bible goes on to explain very clearly. However, Jesus spoke of his death. But they thought that he was talking about taking rest and sleep. And so what did Jesus say? Then Jesus said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead. So he's just said to them, don't worry, Lazarus is sleeping. They said, oh, good. He says, no, Lazarus is dead. So very clear. What is Jesus likening death unto? Pretty plain, isn't it? When he got to Bethany, he was met. And what did he say to the women, the 2 sisters that came out? Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Now, what did Martha understand? When Jesus said this to her, what did she understand by that? What was her understanding about death? Because remember, Martha had spent a lot of time with Jesus. She understood directly from Jesus about what happens when you die, etc. And notice what she says. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. So she was sad. Lazarus had died, but here's the hope she had, that he would rise again in the resurrection at the last day. And then Jesus pointed out something to her. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me, though he may die, he shall live. And this is a truth applicable to everybody. But here, Jesus was going to do something special as a symbol or a model, if you like, of how he's going to do that. He went to the tomb and he said, roll the door away, roll the stone away. And if you read the story, they said, no, don't do that, because he's been dead a number of days and there's going to be a bit of a bad smell because the body would start to rot, of course. You may recall the story. And Jesus says, roll it away anyway. And then he says, Lazarus, come forth. And what happened? Lazarus, who was dead, had been buried a number of days, came forth wrapped up in those garments they used to wrap the bodies in. So what did Jesus liken death to? Jesus said our friend Lazarus sleeps, and he goes to wake him out of his sleep. But really, Lazarus was dead, wasn't he? So can you see the parallel here? Jesus is likening death to a sleep. Now here's some questions we need to answer from the Bible. When people die and go into this sleep state, should we call it, how long will people sleep? If someone dies, and as Jesus describes it, they're asleep in the grave, how long does that sleep last? Well, we read this in the book of Job. So man lieth down and rises not, till the heavens be no more. They shall not awake, nor be raised out of their sleep. Now here's the question, when will the heavens be no more? That's at the end of the world. When Jesus comes back and the heavens roll back like a scroll, it's at the second coming when the heavens be no more. So where are the dead sleeping? Where do we find the dead that are sleeping? It says, many that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, Daniel 12:2. And in John we read, all that are in the graves will hear his voice and shall come forth. Another verse in Job says, if I wait, the grave is my house. So where are the dead at the moment? There's a popular view that when people die, they go straight to heaven. But what is the Bible teaching here? Where do you go when you die? Well, you go down into the grave. Does that make sense? And there you sleep until Jesus comes back. Now some say, hang on, don't you go straight to heaven when you die though? Surely that's what happens. Well, there's another example here in the book of Acts about David, King David. David died a long time ago, 3,000 years ago. And it says, David is both dead and buried, and his sepulchre is with us unto this day. And it goes on to say, for David is not ascended into the heavens. Did David go straight to heaven when he died? No, not according to this. He was buried in his sepulchre. The sepulchre is still with us to this day, they wrote in the book of Acts. And David hadn't gone to heaven yet. So what do the dead know? If somebody's dead, they're sleeping in the grave, what's going on in their mind at the time? What thoughts are running through their head? Well, the answer is nothing. It says, for the living know that they shall die, but the dead know not anything. Also their love, their hatred, and their envy is now perished, it says in Ecclesiastes. And in Psalms it says, his breath goeth forth, he returneth to his earth, and that very day his thoughts perish. So what about the idea the dead are praising God up in heaven? Well, in Psalms it says the dead praise not the Lord. So where are the dead? They're unconscious, they're asleep. Have you ever been in deep sleep? Your head hits the pillow and the next thing you know, you're woken up and it's the morning and the whole night's passed, you weren't even conscious of it. That's exactly what the death of sleep is like. You're unconscious. Now, to help understand this, if we go back to the book of Genesis, how was man created in the first place? And that helps us understand the process that happens when we die. The Bible tells us that the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Can you see that? So there's two elements here. When God created man, he took the dust of the ground, he breathed into him the breath of life, and man became a living soul, the Bible tells us. So essentially, dust of the earth, plus this breath or spirit that God puts into us, and Adam became a living soul. Or you could look at it this way, the elements of the earth, the dust of the ground, plus that breath of life from God, and you have a living being. Some translations actually translate a living being in Genesis. Because essentially the same thing, a living soul equals a living person, one and the same. So God takes the elements of the ground, breathes life into it, and presto, you have a living human being there. So it's quite simple. Body plus the breath of life equals a living soul. There's the formula that God initiated right in the beginning of how man, what we consist of. We consist of elements, and if we die, our body moulders away back into the elements again. So what happens to this formula when we die? Well, it's interesting. God said to Adam, dust thou art, and unto dust thou shalt return. Remember, after they sinned and they lost eternal life, one of the things God said to them was, you came from dust and you're going to go back to dust. And here the Bible spells this out. Psalms, thou hidest thy face, they are troubled. Thou takest away their breath, they die and return to their dust. That's echoing exactly the same thing from Genesis. Another one, Ecclesiastes. Then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit, which literally means breath, it's Hebrew ruach, shall return unto God who gave it. So that's what happens. Does the Bible say that man has an immortal soul? Now there's a big question. What does the Bible say? Ezekiel 18, it says, the soul that sinneth, it shall die. In Revelation 16, it talks about every living soul in the sea died. Even sea animals have souls, it says. They're called souls. And notice this from Ecclesiastes. For that which befalleth the sons of men befalleth beasts. Even one thing befalleth them. As the one dieth, so dieth the other. Yea, they all have one breath, so that a man hath no preeminence above a beast. In terms of our life on earth here, we don't have any preeminence above the beast in terms of having anything special like a soul, so-called an immortal soul. God has given us life, He's given all the animals life. The difference, of course, is God came to die to save human beings. We have another chance at eternal life, and we'll see that as we go on. So are we naturally immortal? Do we have immortality built into us from the day we are born? And the answer is no. It talks about the King of Kings, this is talking about Jesus here, who only hath immortality. Another verse talks about, shall mortal man be more just than God? The only being that has immortality is God. We don't naturally have immortality. Immortality is something we need to seek for, and God will give it as a gift. We don't have it by right born into us. It's interesting, if you do a Bible study in a concordance, the words soul and spirit occur 1,600 times, but never once are they said to be immortal. It was only through access to the tree of life that Adam and Eve had immortality. And we don't have access to that, at least not yet. God is going to restore that, as we'll see. So what is it that we need to seek for? The Bible in Romans says, we're those, in other words us people, who by patient continuance and well-doing seek for glory and honor and immortality, eternal life. Immortality is not something that we naturally have. We lost that way back when Adam and Eve lost access to the tree of life. But that tree of life we'll have access to again if we're faithful and we get taken to heaven. So immortality is something we need to seek for. So when will God's people receive this gift of immortality? When does it happen? And the Bible's quite plain here in Corinthians. It says in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump. And we'll look at when that happens. For the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible. Here it is. And we shall be changed. For this corruptible, that's our present state, must put on incorruption. This mortal, that's us in our present state, must put on immortality. So when this corruptible shall have put on incorruption, and this mortal shall have put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that it is written, death is swallowed up in victory. So immortality is coming, but we don't have it yet naturally. Now here's the question then. If we don't naturally have immortality, and when we die our thoughts perish and we're lying in the grave dead until the resurrection with no consciousness, who are people speaking to when they go and see a spirit medium? Who are these spirits of the dead that are communicating with people? Can the spirits of the dead communicate with us? Well, it says in Job, so man lieth down and rises not, till the heavens be no more, they shall not awake, nor be raised out of their sleep. So can a spirit medium, if you go and see a spirit medium and say, I'll pay you money, can you please bring up my auntie? And some spirit appears, what is that spirit? Is it the spirit of your auntie? According to this, no, it's not. It's a counterfeit. Talks about a dead man. His sons come to honour, and he knoweth it not. They are brought low, but he perceiveth it not of them. In other words, dead people are not consciously looking on what's happening on this earth anymore. They're not looking down from heaven or looking up from hell. When you die, your thoughts perish until the day of the resurrection. Nothing's more is done. It's very interesting to note the very first lie of the devil to mankind, way back in the Garden of Eden. Remember, the serpent was talking to Eve? And one thing he said was this. The serpent said to the woman, "Ye shall not surely die." This was the first lie about spiritualism. Satan saying, you won't die, you're immortal. You know, in the Bible, people who have communications with the dead are actually communications with what's called in the Bible the spirits of devils. And those who believe they're talking with the with the dead loved ones are actually talking with demons. And there's a couple of stories in the Bible like that. The Witch of Endor, and also in Corinthians. There's a bit of homework for you if you want to do some more study. So should Christians try to communicate with dead people? Someone claims to be able to talk to the departed loved ones. Should Christians have anything to do with that? Well, you know, back in the Old Testament, anyone who tried to do that in old Israel was put to death. It says, when they shall say unto you, seek unto them that have familiar spirits, and unto the wizards that chirp and mutter, should not a people seek unto their God on behalf of the living? Should they seek unto the dead? And what does it say? To the law and the testament, if they speak not according to this word, surely there's no light in them. It was actually forbidden for people to try to contact the dead because they were communicating with devils, demons. And here's the thing, people who tried to do this, what was the punishment? A man also or a woman that hath a familiar spirit, here it is, this spirit communications, or that is a wizard shall surely be put to death. They shall stone them with stones, their blood shall be upon them. God said, don't have anything to do with this because it's a deception. Anyone who claims to be able to communicate with the dead, put them to death because they're dealing with devils. That's what it was all about. Now, some people say, but hang on a minute. If you read through the Bible, aren't there some passages that contradict what you've just said? And on the face of it, there are a couple of passages which seem to pose a bit of a question. We'll look at one of them right now. Remember when Jesus was on the cross and he was talking with the thief who was crucified next to him? And you remember the passage? This is what Jesus said. You can look this up in your Bible. Here we go. Jesus said, verily I say unto thee. Remember what happened? The thief on the cross said, remember me when you come into your kingdom. He gave his life to Christ right there and then. And Jesus said this to him, verily I say unto thee, today thou shalt be with me in paradise. Now people look at that and say, there, isn't it obvious? Isn't it clear as anything? Today, Jesus said, today you'll be with me in paradise. So didn't Jesus go to paradise that day with the thief on the cross? Isn't that what the Bible's saying? Well, not quite. Just hold on a second. Did Jesus go to paradise that day? And the answer is no. You can show this from the Bible. Because what happened? He died that day, that Friday, put in the tomb, and he was resurrected on Sunday, and he says, I'm not yet ascended to my Father. And here's the story. Remember when Mary came down to the tomb, and she was weeping, and she heard a voice saying, woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking? And she thought he was the gardener. This is right on resurrection morning. Says she, supposing him to be the gardener, said to him, sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away. She heard this voice and thought it must be the gardener, and he's taken the body out of the tomb. And what did Jesus say? Mary. And she must have recognized that voice straight away. She turned and said to him, Rabboni, which is to say teacher. She suddenly recognized who he was. And notice what Jesus says. Jesus said to her, do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. But go to my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and your God. So what happened? Had Jesus gone to paradise the day that he died? The answer is no. He was put in the tomb, he was resurrected Sunday morning, and then he went to paradise. So he hadn't gone until after he was resurrected. So how do we resolve this little issue here? Where in Luke it says, "Verily I say unto thee, comma, today thou shalt be with me in paradise." And the answer is very, very simple. When the Greek was written, they didn't have any punctuation. The comma that you see here was not in the Greek. There's no commas or full stops in the Greek. There's no capital letters or small letters. It just looks like a big string of letters. And the punctuation here is being put in by the translators where they thought it would best go. But bear in mind that comma is not inspired. And if you put that comma after the word today, it makes perfect sense. Let me illustrate that. It would read then, he says, this is Jesus on the cross. He's nailed to the cross and the thief is next to him and he's saying, "Verily I say unto thee today when I'm dying on the cross, when it looks like I'm defeated, today when I'm dying, I can say to you, you will be with me in paradise." Do you understand what he's saying? He's not saying today you'll be in paradise, but today when I'm dying on the cross, I can tell you that you will be with me when he gets to paradise. That's what it means. And you can see how the punctuation makes such a big difference. For example, here's a sentence in English here. I don't know, I hope you ladies don't mind this, but have a look at this. It says, "A woman without her man is nothing." What do you think of that? Do you agree with that sentence? Now I'm not going to change any of the words here. I'm just going to put in some punctuation so you can sort of see what that's saying. I'll put in 2 commas and look what it does to the meaning. It says, "A woman without her man is nothing." Can you see the difference? Just by changing the punctuation, it totally alters the meaning. This is saying a woman without a man is nothing. This is saying a woman without her man is nothing. Can you see it totally changes the meaning? That's why you have to be careful of punctuation. The Bible is consistent with itself, and if you find what appears to be a contradiction, look a little bit deeper, and you'll find that usually it's just our understanding, or maybe the punctuation in that case, alters the meaning. Punctuation can make a difference. The wonderful thing is that Jesus got victory over the grave because he was raised from the dead. He now gives us a victory. Sorry about my croaky throat. And because Jesus was resurrected, he can take us back to heaven with him. Blessed and holy is he who has part in the first resurrection. Over such, the second death has no power. That first resurrection is going to happen when Jesus comes back. When Jesus comes back in all his glory. And here's the description from the Bible in Thessalonians. It says, "The Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of an archangel, and with the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first." Here it is. "Then we who are alive and remain," in other words, people are still alive on earth when Jesus comes back, not those that have died and gone to the grave, but we which are alive shall be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the end. Here's the rapture where God's people are taken away. "And thus we shall always be with the Lord." So when Jesus comes back, he's going to call from the grave, just as he raised people from the dead when he was on earth. Sorry. He's going to do the same again. Apologies for my croaky throat. So, how are we to comfort one another with these words? It's very interesting. So it quotes this passage again. "For the Lord himself shall descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and the trumpet of God." Sorry about that. "And the dead in Christ shall rise first. Then we which are alive and remain shall be caught up together with him in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air." And what does he say at the end? "Wherefore comfort one another with these words." So if you've had a dead loved one, someone who you've loved dearly and they've died and gone to the grave, there's no stress at all. They're not looking down in agony or anxiousness about what's happening on earth, anyone who's died in the Lord is asleep in the grave, unconscious, just like a deep sleep. And when Jesus comes back, all those are going to be raised up together, and those who remain on the earth are going to be caught up, and off to heaven we go. And that's a comforting thought, according to Paul here in Thessalonians. In other words, comfort one another with the fact that those who are dead in Christ are simply sleeping in their graves, just like Lazarus was. And when Jesus comes, he's going to just wake them up out of their sleep. And that's when we receive immortality. That's when it's going to be absolutely wonderful. So we can thank God that the dead rest in peace, unconscious in the grave. They're not looking down. Can you imagine the torment if somebody died and went to heaven and their family was going through a horrible time on earth? How there'd be an anxiousness up in heaven. You understand? Anguish, looking down. But that's not the case. Anyone who's died is unconscious, sleeping in the grave according to the Bible. And the passing of time between death and the resurrection will seem like nothing. Just like a deep sleep. When you put your head on the pillow, next thing you know, it's morning. That's what it'll be like. And so this is protection. This understanding is protection against the danger of spiritualism and demons pretending to be dead loved ones. There's been cases where people in seances have heard things from supposedly dead loved ones that they thought only my dead loved one knew that fact. But you know who else knows? The devil knows things, doesn't he? The devil can pretend to mimic dead loved ones. But if we know the truth, the dead are not conscious, they're asleep in the grave. Anyone who claims to talk to dead people are not talking to the dead people at all. It's demonic counterfeit, then we're safe from that. This papyrus recorded, very intriguing. It says the fire ran along the ground. There was hail and fire mingled with the hail. Very intriguing. That's almost a direct quote from the Bible. And this is from an Egyptian record that has nothing to do with the Bible. And it goes on here to talk about how columns and walls are consumed by fire. Interesting. It talked about the plague of locusts in the Bible. They covered the whole face of the earth, so the land was darkened. And they ate every herb and all the fruit. And it says, there remained not any green thing in the trees. So these locusts just stripped everything bare. This papyrus talked about no fruit nor herbs are found. It talks about trees are destroyed and the branches are stripped off. And it mentions a noise. It says, oh, that the earth would cease from noise and tumult. Uproar be no more. That maybe was the beating of the wings, these clouds and clouds of locusts. The Bible talked about a thick darkness in the land for 3 days. And it's interesting, this papyrus records something very similar. It says the land is without light. Then, of course, the last plague, the most devastating of all. It talks about all the firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die. Of course, except where they put the blood on the doorposts, as you may recall. And what happened? This struck Egypt very severely. Even Pharaoh, his firstborn died. It says, Pharaoh rose up in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great... One thing to notice when you're looking at Egyptian history is that you go to different books, different scholars, and the picture is not always the same. And here's one scholar that makes a very good point here. Here's a statement from a very well-known Egyptologist, Sir Alan Gardner. As you can see, he's very well qualified. And this is what he had to say. It must never be forgotten that we're dealing with a civilization thousands of years old, and one of which only tiny remnants have survived. What is proudly advertised as Egyptian history is merely a collection of rags and tatters. And that's a good point to note. When people try to take Egyptian culture and history and try to fit it into the Bible, you're dealing with something that we're only seeing glimpses of, if you know what I mean. Most of the Egyptian history has been lost, and we've only got little bits to go on. So there's always a little bit of a danger when you try to connect Egyptian history with Bible history. But I'd like to share some things, and again, you can decide on this, just how well things do tie up. Now, for years, scholars have said the Bible must be made up because when you go to Egyptian history, you don't find the Exodus story found in the Bible. You don't find it in Egypt, at least Egyptian history as it's been recorded by the Egyptians. And because of that, here's a typical statement that some of the scholars make. This gentleman here, Philip Davies, is a professor of biblical studies at the University of Sheffield, and he said this. He said the society that was created in the Bible and their history, when you compare what the Bible had to say about the Exodus. First of all, let's look at some Bible verses that described what was going on in Egypt at the time, and you compare that with what this papyrus reported. It's quite interesting. Remember in Exodus chapter 7, it talked about how Moses lifted up this rod and smote the waters, and all the waters that were in the river were turned to blood. And it said the Egyptians digged round about the river for water to drink because they couldn't drink the river water. Now this papyrus, which you can see in the museum in Holland, talks about pestilences throughout the land, blood is everywhere, and it goes on to say the river, which is the Nile, is blood. Men shrink and thirst after water. Now that's interesting. Someone might say, well, that's a coincidence. And some scholars try to write these off as, well, it's just a coincidence, or maybe there was a flood and the water got discoloured. But some of the details you'll see as we go on are very specific. The Bible talked about a plague upon the cattle, the horses, the asses, the camels, the oxen, and the sheep, a very grievous plague. This papyrus talked about all animals, their hearts weep, cattle moan. So something was happening with the cattle when this papyrus is recorded. Now here's a very interesting one. The Bible talks about hail coming down, and it says fire ran along upon the ground. Very intriguing. That's not normal hail, is it? And it says, so there was hail and fire mingled with the hail, very grievous. Now it's obviously not normal hail that we see today, is it? But have a look at what Moses went to meet Pharaoh. You remember the story how Pharaoh refused to let God's people go. And so God sent the plagues. Do you remember that? Here's a little picture of the stars being turned to snakes. You remember that? We're dealing with a real battle here between truth and error. And God sent the plagues. Remember, here's the list of the 10 plagues that God sent. Now, these were devastating. If you go through the plagues and look at them, they absolutely devastated Egypt. Like the locusts, it says, basically consumed everything that was living on the ground. You had hail mingled with fire. You had the cattle getting diseases. And of course, the last one, all the firstborn were slain. These plagues devastated Egypt. Now, you think you'd find some record somewhere of this event, and you do, not on the stone monuments, but in the papyrus records. Now, the papyrus was built from this plant that used to grow in the Nile. It's not in Egypt anymore. That's an interesting Bible prophecy that papyrus would cease from the land of Egypt. But back in the time of the Exodus, they used to use papyrus for records. You can go to Egypt today and see how they, even today, for the tourists, they make up papyrus sheets by taking strips of the papyrus plant and they roll it out and weave it together, make paper. And I'd like to share with you a papyrus that's found in Holland, in the Leiden Museum there, Leiden, Netherlands, the Dutch Museum of Antiquities. There's the papyrus called the Ipuwer Papyrus. Has anyone heard of the Ipuwer Papyrus? Maybe not. Well, when you look at the translation of this, it's very interesting. It was an imaginary one, a fictional one. I don't believe in the reality of 3.5 million people wandering across the Sinai Desert for 40 years. I don't believe in the crossing of the Red Sea with the water standing up. And this is the view of many scholars today, particularly in academic circles and university. They essentially say, we don't believe the Bible. It's imaginary. As he says here, it's a fictional one, an imaginary one. And what I put to you, if you look in the right place and think carefully about what you'd expect to find, you do find bits of evidence, even in Egyptian history, about the Exodus story. And we'll look at some of those tonight and see if we can join some of the dots. So we're going to go to the land of the pyramids again, just briefly. One thing to note is the inscriptions and the monuments they built weren't there to record the Daily News. A lot of these monuments there were to make the pharaoh look like a god, because essentially Egyptians believed the pharaoh was a god on earth. And most of these monuments were built to extol the virtues of the pharaoh. Do you follow that? It's sort of to make him look like a hero, and therefore he deserved to be the king of Egypt. And so what you find recorded here is not always entirely accurate history. In fact, there's accounts on some of these, like a particular pharaoh conquering the Hittites and winning many victories. But when you go to the Hittite records, you actually find out that the pharaoh lost some of these battles. So you've got to be careful. You have to compare one group of records with another, and you find they don't always match up. Now, if we go back to the story of the Exodus, when